Hello, my name is Helen Paynter. I'm a Baptist minister and tutor in biblical studies at Bristol Baptist College. I don't know if you began the new year with the resolution of reading all the way through the Bible. I'm aware that quite a lot of people start a new year with that sort of plan, plough through Genesis, maybe get on quite well with Exodus, at least the first half, but by the time they get to Leviticus, things are quite tricky. And a lot of people who have really good intentions to read all the way through stumble at Leviticus and then just give up. So what I want to do is offer a short series of short videos to try and help you keep going through Leviticus, show you some of the wonderful things that it contains, but also hopefully just kind of coach you through so that you can keep going on into Numbers and Deuteronomy and then on into the rest of Scripture. So with that in mind, I'm going to do just 2 or 3 minute videos for each of the major sections in Leviticus, and this is an introductory one. Let's just set Leviticus in its scene, although you've probably got a good idea of this if you've been reading through. You'll remember that God's people have been slaves in Egypt, and God, acting alone and without any assistance in human terms, God has brought them out of Egypt and took them to Mount Sinai, where he made a binding covenant with them. Now, everything that happens in Leviticus, we need to set into the context of that covenant. God has made this binding agreement with his people. He's acted purely out of love and grace. Sometimes people say, oh, the covenant at Leviticus, in Sinai was a covenant of law. No, the law was given after the grace. The law was given in order to help God's people to live well as his people. That's a really important thing to understand as we begin to read the book of Leviticus. One of the things God says when he makes the covenant with his people at Sinai is, you are a holy nation, a nation of priests, a kingdom of priests. And Leviticus is, if you like, a set of ways to be who God has already declared that they are. So that's the background, if you like, that's the setting. Now, the big theme of Leviticus, the thing that you should hold on to as you read all the way through, is this: how do we live in the divine presence? This is the question that Israel is struggling with. We're going to see again and again that sometimes being in God's presence is threatening. You may well have seen that in Exodus already, but being in God's presence is absolutely desirable. Think back to the Garden of Eden. Think about how Adam and Eve were at the beginning, and they were naked and unashamed, not just before each other, but before God. And the consequence of their sin was being put out of the divine presence. And so one of the key ideas of Leviticus is we so need God's presence, and it is such a threat inherently because of human sin. And that's the tension that underlies the book of Leviticus. Hold that in your mind as you read. Now then, there's a kind of little bit of background information it's quite helpful to have as you begin. And this is the idea of what we might call graded holiness, that things and people can fall into one of kind of 3 categories. So they can be clean. That's the kind of natural state of things and people, is that they are what's called clean. If we move in that direction, if you like, they become unclean. Now, things become unclean by contact with other unclean things, or certain things are inherently unclean. Certain animals are inherently unclean. People become unclean often by bodily discharges, but also by sin. So it's a kind of odd category. It doesn't fit the way we think nowadays. We tend to think, we don't think that people with bodily discharges are in the same category as people who are morally bad. In the mind of the Leviticus writer, these things, and in the mind of ancient Israel, these things occupy the same category. So things or people can be unclean, they can be clean, or they can be holy. So if something is unclean, it can be cleansed, potentially, to become clean. Something that is clean can potentially become sanctified to be holy, and something that's holy can go into the sanctuary, into the tabernacle. And then if you move in the other direction, something that is holy might become profaned and then simply be clean. And that's kind of okay for everyday use, but can't go back out into the sanctuary then. And then something that is clean might be polluted and become unclean. So think of these as categories which do kind of have a moral element with some people, but there's also, it's a bigger category than simple kind of ethics or morality. It's an odd way of thinking, but it will help you to understand what's going on in the book. Now, one last thing to say before I encourage you to dive into the book, and that is just to talk about the structure very briefly, and it's in what we might call a ring structure. So the first 7 chapters are what we might call sanctuary laws. These are laws about how, laws about the sanctuary, the tabernacle, which was like a temple in a tent, a way of meeting God, in a place to meet with God, a place where the priests did their stuff. The first 7 chapters are about sanctuary laws. Then we've got chapters about the priests, about consecration of the priests. Then we've got chapters about holiness, personal holiness. So we've got sanctuary, priests, personal holiness. And then we've got the center of the book, which is chapter 16, the Day of Atonement. Now, after the center of the book, we come back down and we've got another set that kind of about personal holiness, personal laws. Then we've got another set that are about priests again. I'm going the right way, yes. And then finally, we've got another set that's kind of about the sanctuary. So we've got this kind of structure which kind of mirrors itself, and the central part is the Day of Atonement. Notice that structure as you go, and I'm going to give one little video for each of those elements in the structure. So that'll be 7 more little videos just to show you something in the book, just to encourage you as you read. It won't tell you everything you need to know. It'll just show you something, basically just kind of coach you through Leviticus, show you some of the highlights, and keep you going on your journey of reading the Bible through. And let me just say one last thing, which is that most of what I'm showing you is the work of other people who studied this in depth. Leviticus isn't my specialism. I'm an Old Testament specialist, but I spend most of my time in Kings and Judges and Numbers. Leviticus isn't my specialism. So I'm using the work of many other people. Don't think this is, if you hear something you've never heard before, you think it's brilliant. It's not Helen being brilliant, it's other people. Particularly, I'm using the work of Michael Morales and Gordon Wenham. And I encourage you to read their work if you want to follow up on any of this. But for now, go back, start reading Leviticus. When it gets hard, hang on in there. There's wonderful things to be discovered, although it is difficult and mysterious. But I'll see you soon.